everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today we have two of the members of the Enosis Therapeutics team on, Dr. Prash and Agnieszka. How are you both doing today?
Very well, thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. So we got to bump into each other in person in Wonderland in Miami. I saw your very large VR setup and eyeballed it for days before approaching you and trying to get access. But you had a lot of people there, so I was kind of fascinated by how many people you were able to like run through your process and like show your software too. So I guess before we go too deep, I want to talk about I guess like really high level, what is Enosis and what are you trying to do, and then we'll jump into you as individuals.
Excellent. We are essentially a medtech company that is developing psychotherapy tools. These are psychotherapy tools that can be used with psychedelics or in any other psychotherapy. So we are leveraging virtual reality for its immersive properties, for its state-altering properties, and basically any unique mechanisms that we can identify through immersive experiential methods that can be used to improve patient outcomes, but also to improve the experience for the therapist. And basically use technology so that we can scale access to mental health.
Thank you for that. Yeah, medtech, obviously an important field. We need a lot more of it, and we will. And I'm glad you two are part of the team. So I guess let's dig into you as individuals. Like Dr. Prash, how did you start getting interested in this psychedelic space and also the VR technology space?
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist. Who did psychiatry purely to work with psychedelics. So I finished medical school. I thought I was going to be a surgeon. I was in surgical training. And then I discovered psychedelics. And much to the dismay of some around me, probably including my parents, I rapidly lost interest in operating on the body and switched to psychiatry training purely for the purpose of working with psychedelics. That's always been the game, which almost a decade ago was not easy. And I've been a pretty loud advocate of psychedelic therapy for about the last decade in Australia. VR is pretty new to me. In fact, I had very little exposure to it until Agnieszka introduced it to me. We were working on another paper, and she was badgering me about this idea that she had. And it took almost 6 months for the penny to drop. And then once it dropped, I don't know how to continue the analogy, but that penny stayed in the wallet quite deeply. But yes, that's how this marriage happened.
Awesome. And Agnieszka, for you, like, how did you get interested in this intersection, and what made you compelled enough to kind of push for this project?
So my background is a little bit more complex. I actually started as an architect. So I studied architecture. I worked as an architect for a while. And then I went back to school to do my master's and discovered science. And there was no going back for me. So I switched into biomedical science. In that time, so as an architect, I've learned a lot of 3D modeling methods. And that was kind of my way into the biomedical science. So I was leveraging a lot of those 3D modeling skills that weren't really present in biomedicine at the time. It was very new. So it was a little bit of an exploration for me of how I can use this, how I can use those novel tools that no one else around me seemed to know to advance the medical field. So for a few years of my life, I was responsible for coming into medical research labs and introducing 3D to advance their research efforts. And that included 3D modeling, that included VR at the time as well, that were obviously not very advanced VR methods at the time, although I was very, very lucky to work at some cutting edge institutes. So I used virtual reality for crime scene investigation, for example, at the Forensic Institute, or for the use of virtual autopsies. I did that for Mars mission simulations, for nuclear medicine. So I got quite familiar with VR and a little bit obsessed with that technology in some ways. But as much as it seemed like it was very advanced use of that method, it always felt to me like it's lacking something. Like we are trying to use this incredible technology to replicate anything we see around us. So to replicate the world and to basically make things a little bit easier, a little bit more comfortable, which didn't really seem fair for the kind of tech that was developed in order to expand our consciousness, because that's the origins of VR. It was actually inspired by psychedelics, and it was meant to expand our consciousness. I think it was Timothy Leary who said that thanks to VR, he can see beyond the reality horizon. And that always sort of stuck with me as that there must be something more to that we can explore. We can be a little bit more curious about and a little bit more explorative. And so that idea has always been at the back of my head. When Prash and I met, we were both interested in mental health more broadly. So I started to focus more on neuroscience in my research. Prash was obviously very interested in psychedelics and altered states of consciousness. And we started to explore that idea together a little bit on how can we use state-altering methods to improve mental health outcomes. There wasn't so much in that field at the time that would look at state-altering methods more broadly. So as Prash mentioned, we started to work on a research paper together to create a little bit of a taxonomy of those methods. So how can we look at different mechanisms of state-altering modalities, and how can we make the biggest use of them? And the conclusion of the paper was that if we combine some of those methods, we might see synergistic effects and better mental health outcomes. And obviously, with my kind of intimate relationship with VR, the immediate thought was, well, VR could be that modality. It isn't used like that, but it has the potential for it. So can we use tech to support those more traditional methods? And with Prash's experience with psychedelics and deep knowledge on psychedelics, that seemed like quite an obvious synergy to explore for us. So we started looking at how they're similar and how they're different, so that when we combine them, what can come out of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's how the project started.
I love that thinking. So, I've got my device right next to me, and I bought it to evaluate what's going on in the scene. Like, is there anything practically useful? And you kind of hinted at, it seemed like the drive is, how do we make this photorealistic and so immersive that we can't tell the difference? We're a long way off from that. But that said, there's still plenty of applications. And I think you came up with a really cool set of those. And I didn't even consider that you were converging a lot of different kind of uses or means of manipulating the organism that's in the mix. Like I didn't even really consider that before. So I find that really interesting. There's so many things to actually dig into here. So I guess why VR to other technology? We've got like TMS, we've got like all sorts of biofeedback, neurofeedback tech, but like why VR?
VR is very unique when you compare it to other tech. The question, this is something that we get a lot from psychedelic purists, that question of why would you even bother with technology? Of course, I think a lot of people forget that everything around us is technology. Pen is a form of technology, but I don't hear anyone complaining about people journaling after the psychedelic experience of using too much technology to integrate their psychedelic experience. It's the most unique human trait, right? That's what differentiates us from other species, the ability to use tools. And we want to see people make the most out of it rather than be scared of that. And yet VR in itself is even more unique than all those other tools. In a lot of ways, it's not really, at least in my mind, it's not really a digital type of technology. It is, again, an immersive tool. It is something that gives you that different perception of reality. It is something that inspires a very deep sense of presence. That presence is something that's very important to us, especially in therapy, which is one of the big obstacles to gaining the biggest amount of benefits from psychotherapeutic engagement. And so we want to inspire that sense of presence as much as we can. And there's nothing more inspiring for that sense of presence than being focused on that environment that is very unique, very novel, and that hijacks all of your sensory motor skills basically at the same time. The immersiveness of it is kind of composed of a few different things, one of which is the buffering from everything around you. This is not something that can be said about, for example, Zoom, right? Or any 2D display technology, because as much as you can focus on that, as much as you can use that for a lot of good, there's still all of the other aspects of the environment around you that can be very distracting. In VR, there's absolutely nothing else that you can focus on other than that virtual world. And I think that's a very important aspect of VR that is quite often forgotten, that the buffering capacity of VR. Would you like to?
Yeah, I can offer for me, one of the big reasons of why VR and why it really clicked when the penny finally dropped for me was that in the psychedelic state, we have infinite presence, and we have the capacity to access insights that we have no capacity to do so in our normal sort of cognitive daily states. It's not good at getting stuff done. Right? Try making an omelette when you're tripping, and it's a pointless venture. So processing, executive functioning becomes quite limited. That's half the point, right, of that experience. So we have all these insights that emerge during the psychedelic experience, and then we try and process it in the non-psychedelic state. But that state relies very strongly on memory to be able to pull you back into where you were, to try and remember the full experiential inputs that emerged in the psychedelic experience. And VR would seem to be able to create a liminal space, something that wasn't there and that wasn't here, something where you still had access to your cognitive faculties as you would want to in the sober state, but you had the advantage of both the presence as well as being in a completely different, and in that way an altered state than you would normally, and therefore being able to inch closer towards those insights. And that in-between state was what was so fascinating for me.
It's a bridge in a lot of ways, right? It's a bridge between an altered state of consciousness and a normal state of consciousness. It's a bridge between technology and experience. And it's that experience component of it that is very important to us. If you think about psychedelic psychotherapy, it's a procedure, right? It's an ongoing process that lasts from preparation through dosing up to integration and beyond. But what we've managed to do with current setup for psychotherapy is that we isolate the psychedelic journey as the experience, and then everything else becomes a much more cognitive, analytical process that is no longer really experiential. And it was maintaining of that experience that was a big inspiration for us. So to make sure that the psychedelic experience doesn't only last for those several hours when you have taken the substance, but that entire psychedelic psychotherapy becomes an experience.
There's this, you mentioned this idea of it being in beside, like you've got your waking consciousness, you've got your psychedelic experience, and just being in a VR environment, it's kind of like an interesting liminal state that could theoretically open some interesting access to things that, like you say, like memory, it's a little hard in your normal waking consciousness to access. So even that alone, that's a really interesting concept. So
absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about the development process. So like, are you a developer yourself, or were you able to pull in developers to help with this?
We've pulled in developers. Agnieszka is principally the designer of everything that we're doing. She's the architect. So as much as she says she went from architect to science, she's back to being the architect. And we have a phenomenal developer and his team who we utilize to, turn the designs into reality.
And we've got a great medical advisory board as well. What's important to us is that it has not been a quick process. This has taken years of research before we've done the first little 3D object within that space. We've published a paper on how to use VR with psychedelics and what are the different properties that could be leveraged, what are the different mechanisms that we could draw on, and what are the possible combinations of VR and psychedelics together. And from that, we went to any psychotherapist or medical doctor or anyone in the field that we've known that have had experience with psychedelic therapy. And we've discussed those potential applications, and we've explored how we can actually make the best of those two worlds. And we've built the design principles way before we've explored any of the VR scenarios themselves. So as a result of that research and the result of the interviews with the therapists, we came up with several of those principles, one of them being those experiential moments and maintaining experiential moments in therapy. And based on those principles, we started to sketch very slowly the basic wireframe for the design. And from then, we would get feedback, and we would iterate constantly and basically redesign the whole thing based on what we've been hearing from the therapists and from potential users, and build on that. So the process has been actually quite tedious, quite long. It's taken several years to come up with that scenario, which, as you've seen, it's not that complicated. It's actually the simplicity of it that I think is the most convincing for us, because most of the psychotherapeutic approaches have quite a lot of simplicity to them. They have a lot of underlying ideas that are very similar across all the psychotherapeutic methods. And that's something that was important for us, because once you distill it down to those basic ideas, there's a lot of overlap. As much as we might want to say that, acceptance commitment therapy is better for certain situations, that internal family systems is better for others or for other people, there are a lot of underlying similarities that are those basic building blocks of just that therapeutic engagement and the process of healing. And that's what we were trying to resemble within that VR environment, to create that toolbox that contains all those basic ideas and assumptions, and provide that to the therapist and to the patient so they can use that in whatever way they find most fit.
Yeah.
I forgot that the data would be exposed to the therapist, and I think that's amazing, actually, for helping develop plans. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say there's considerable nuance to the design which doesn't show up. And again, that's half the point. You don't want it to show up. But the amount of thought that went into something like the setting, and for example, you want something that is unfamiliar enough or far away enough from one's normal reality as to be able to put them in a foreign situation. But at the same time, familiar enough that it isn't threatening, that it isn't too leading, and working out the exact setting, the elements within the setting that would sort of fit in that intermediate area. Yeah, just something as simple as that takes a lot of thinking. But when you actually look at it, it's, well, you picked this. It doesn't show up. But I think that's where the skill is, in that nuance.
It's that delicate balance between the novelty and the intuition that we want to use both for patients to feel both comfortable and that give them that sense of knowing what they're doing and what they're working with, but at the same time creating something that isn't familiar and doesn't bring up any of the other memories, or gives you that sense of being, this is my space. This is that new space I haven't experienced before.
Yeah, that's important, right? There's so many people coming from so many different levels of technological skill and fluence. And like the fact that you could throw somebody in their 60s in here and it would probably work just as well for somebody that's 15 and a VR aficionado, like that's pretty good. And I do agree that it was quite intuitive. And after one session, like I think follow-up sessions would actually be even more useful and quicker. It's fascinating because I've been thinking for ages about how VR could be useful in mental health and just in general. And I couldn't come up with what it was. We'll just say, preparation integration, like just put it out there loosely and not actually develop the idea, but you took years developing the concept. And yeah, I'm sure that was endless for you, but it seems like you're making some good headway. And where are you now with it? Is it in clinics in some places?
It is. It is in clinics. We've got a number of different clinics using the product at the moment. Our focus has been very much on, well, within the psychedelic space. So it's been ketamine clinics who've been using it and running parallel streams of ketamine therapy and VR modulated ketamine therapy. And their clinics also have a research focus. So we'll be able to collect data for us, which is going to be really interesting. More recently, we've brought on, for example, a clinic which is far not just focused on ketamine, the psychedelic space, but far more on sort of human performance coaching and human optimization, which aligns a lot with, I think, our ethos, certainly my personal ethos of how I feel psychedelics should be used rather than waiting for pathology to develop. But it also shows the potential of how a VR scenario could be utilized as a more general tool for all manner of consolidation of information.
Right. Yeah.
We are very excited about clinics using it in ways that they find most fit. Like the main principle for it is that we are designing the toolbox for therapists to decide how to best work with that. So exploring that human optimization, exploring using it for self-journaling, for example, it's all very exciting for us to see how people can really push it. It's like enabling humans to take that leadership in their healing pathway. And it doesn't mean that we have to be prescriptive with it. I kind of, it might be very utopian, but I kind of feel like we all intuitively have a sense of what works for us and where to take things, at least to a certain degree. And that freedom should be allowed within a certain framework that is supportive. And that's what we're trying to do, to support people to develop their own method of self-healing.
I love that. Based on my experience, it at the very least gives you a new way to deal with internal things, a new way of experiencing, and honestly, I think working with is a really good phrase. Like, it's certainly helps save it. I guess, can we describe like what goes on in there? Because right now it feels like it's just a black box and we can't. Yeah. How would you want to describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are kind of two components to it. One is the process of anchoring the psychedelic experience. So patients at the end of their psychedelic experience or immediately after usually tend to have a large number of insights, emotions, thoughts, and new perspectives that emerge as a result of taking the substance. But what we know is that they are quite easily forgotten. Or at least you lose that sense of personal connection to them. They become a little bit more cognitive. So like you're aware of having that wider perspective, for example, and the fact that that everything is interconnected, but it quite quickly loses that emotional relationship with that statement. And what we wanted to do is to preserve that emotional load that is associated with those statements. And so what happens is that patients, after their experience, use the virtual reality as a multisensory canvas onto which they project everything that happened during their psychedelic journey in the way that is as raw, as free-flowing as possible. So you might know that what usually happens in more traditional or clinical approaches is that process of forming the first narrative. So patients are encouraged to give an account of what happened without any prompts from the therapist, without trying to make a meaning. But still, it's a very linear kind of account, right? Because you speak from A to B to C of how you went through the experience. But realistically, those things come up in a very disjointed manner. And that's what we wanted to reflect within the VR space. So patients project those thoughts or insights through audio recordings in their own voice as separate objects within the VR space. And they can be either objects that are already within this space that are quite abstract, or they can create those objects themselves. So they can express themselves visually, again, multisensory canvas. You can draw whatever happened to you. You can build a 3D model of something that might have emerged during the experience. And then you create an audio recording that is associated with that. And so what we end up with after the psychedelic session or the dosing session is that collection of insights that are stored within the VR space. And this is our basic building block for what we work with during the integration. So the important thing is that we preserve those insights in an unchanged manner, in this chaotic kind of composite sort of structure that has been created by the patient himself. And then we use that as the baseline to work with during the integration process. So the patient, once they've projected everything, once they kind of dumped everything that happened to them during the psychedelic session, they take off the VR headset and proceed as per usual session. And then they come back to that same VR scenario during the debriefing and during the integration sessions to process all those insights. So they come back to that same environment, the same immersive environment that they've seen after the psychedelic experience, and they follow the process of listening back to all those accounts in their own voice, which usually has this kind of either a lot of emotional load or that sense of conviction, that kind of self-reassurance of what happened. And that in itself is already a very strong prompt to generate further insights or thoughts or narratives. And so we encourage patients to keep kind of generating those insights and keep recording more and more. And once we've got a certain amount of those insights, now we've got the material to work with during the integration. So we've explored that process of anchoring the psychedelic experience. And then during integration, once we can return to those anchors, we start the process of mind mapping. And the mind mapping works, as you might have imagined, hearing the word mind mapping, is basically exploring those insights, is searching for different connections and links between those insights, is creating themes or groups that might be around, a certain relationship that emerged during your psychedelic experience, or something related to your physical environment, something related to your physical health, for example. So there's those themes that are generated that become groups that the insights are becoming associated with. And this is one of those building blocks of the therapeutic frameworks that we spoke about that appear throughout every therapeutic approach that we can think of, trying to identify different themes in your life and how they connect, how they link with each other. But what VR space allows you to do is to explore that in a multisensory environment without needing to create a linear narrative, but rather explore everything in that disjointed free-form manner, which resembles much more how we actually think, resembles much more how things happen to us, right? No one actually develops a mental health problem moving from A to B to C. There's a lot of things that come into play that are related either directly or indirectly. And so that exploration allows us to really dive into how we think and how the mind mapping works. So that's the premise of the therapeutic process. There is a lot of symbolism that is involved. Patients can create representations of things that happen to them or that emerge during the therapy. And we encourage psychobehavioral change through symbolic actions that they can take. And then obviously there's a whole range of possibilities with VR that we are adding on and building on depending on what kind of feedback we get from patients. Obviously the sky is the limit when it comes to virtual reality.
And we're just getting started, right? Like this, like the hardware, like while super effective and interesting, like it leaves a lot desired. And like, I can't wait. Like I was so disappointed when the new hardware came out from Meta, the Quest 2. I was like, I was expecting like this kind of an update, not like this couple inches of an update. But despite that, it still seems to work really well. It's still wildly compelling. You said something about mind mapping there, and the first thing that came to mind was like the Groff concept of condensed experience systems, or COEX, and like how things of a certain theme and or association can kind of pile up. And if you could expose these kind of systems and patterns through visualization, you could really like get a lot of depth there. And maybe smooth entry into working on those things. I find that really interesting.
Two things I might add to that.
Please.
If the process of psychotherapy, the basic premise of almost everything we do in psychotherapy is to make the unconscious conscious, right? Because once it's conscious, you can actually work on it, but most of the time we are held back by unconscious patterns, loops, behaviors. The problem with therapy is that as much as you make that unconscious conscious, it still sits within this intangible ether, which we call the therapeutic frame. And you expect it to come back into therapy again and again. And that's why routine, having the same place, the same therapist, the same setting is quite useful, because you're trying to manage this intangible sense of that therapeutic frame. And what we're looking to do is as you're making the unconscious conscious, to make that conscious now tangible, so that this mental model no longer needs to sit in the ether, but can actually sit and be projected onto this wireframe that is the VR scenario that can be manipulated dynamically and in real time. That's one thing. The other is my favorite analogy, which I like to think of psychedelic therapy as a bit like blast fishing, which is sort of dynamite fishing, where you drop dynamite in the pond and the fish will bubble up to the surface. Yeah. So, and what we're trying to do then is scoop up all this fish, which are the insights that bubble up, and make dinner, which is psychobehavioral change. The problem is we make that dinner over a period of 6, 8, 10 weeks. And it's really hard to keep that fish fresh over time, right? And what we have developed is a really effective net to scoop up all that fish, a freezer in which to keep the fish fresh, and a fully stocked kitchen in which to cook dinner. And I'll stop with the analogy now because I can get carried away with my analogies. But
well, since we're getting more and more abstract, I might take it a step further and go on a little bit of a sci-fi tangent. The idea of telepathy. Why is telepathy so alluring? It's not really about the fact that you don't have to use your mouth to communicate things to someone. That is just easier to be able to just project thoughts onto someone rather than speak out loud, right?
You two are killing me. It's like a lot of amazing Leary and McKenna stuff going on. I'm going to let you keep going now, though.
It's that kind of that alluring fact that you could actually project your entire network of thoughts and emotions that are all interconnected onto someone all in one go. So instead of needing to fit that into that linear narrative, you can actually project that network onto someone. And that's what we're trying to do. Just imagine that you build out that network, that you make it physically visible and tangible, and you can actually have someone that comes into that space and visits that network. So you can share your mental model with anyone that you want. It can be a therapist, it can be a guide, it can be a shaman, it can be a well-being specialist, it can be your partner, it can be your parent, it can be your child, it can be anyone that you wish had better understanding of you, but they don't. And it is very hard to understand. I mean, it's hard to understand ourselves, let us say understand each other based on those linear narratives. But if we actually see how people connect things, how they see those links, I feel like we have a much better chance to actually connect to each other and have a better understanding of consciousness. If you think about child psychologists, we completely accepted that it's an important part of the process for a child psychologist to observe a child at play. Because it's not just about the content of what the child is communicating, it's about the processes that they use to understand the world, to interact with the world. But somehow when it comes to adults, we've completely abandoned that idea. We just presume that everyone has that capacity to form a logical narrative of everything that happened to them. It's ridiculous.
Even though they're in therapy precisely because they are unable to form that logical narrative of what happened to them.
Yeah, which I'd argue none of us actually can do that, because that's not how we think. We decided, or in the process of becoming more advanced species, it became so easy to rely on language because we're so good at it. But it is really the path of least resistance in a lot of ways. And we've taken that path of least resistance. And there's some studies or some researchers that suggest that because we rely on language so strongly, we've kind of abandoned and forgotten a lot of the other skills, a lot of the other sort of perceptual abilities, that we can't connect with nature the way we used to, that we can't see patterns in nature the way we used to, because there is that single mode of communication that we rely on so strongly. And so if we imagine being able to observe how people process things, that context of processing and not just the content, I feel like we might have a much better chance at both therapy, but also really diving into the human consciousness and to understanding a brain as an operating system.
That's great. The Terence McKenna line is, I can actually show you what I mean in a physical sense. And I was kind of picking that up on how you were describing it. And he meant that from like the shamanic context, but also more in the VR concept in his later days, as this was becoming a possibility, and how helpful that is. Yeah, there's like a limit to verbal communication. I think we all understand that. Most communication, I guess. And this is an extra layer where we can communicate more. Yeah. And the fish analogy, Terence McKenna always loved that fish analogy too. Like, I'm going on a fishing expedition. I'm going to bring back some stuff for the village. So those are the two things that were really getting me there. But I love that concept of, interacting and watching the process and the way in which somebody's interacting with things or playing. I find that really interesting. And I wonder if we couldn't even expose further stories, like valuable helpful stories, by, observing how, how does somebody choose to be Godzilla and smash that city, in VR, for instance, right? Like, yeah, I remember playing, what was it? The first ever Grand Theft Auto, probably 1995 or something, with like a much younger friend. And all she wanted to do was stop at all the stoplights and drive safely. It's like, cute, but I think you're missing it. But she's a great doctor now, so it worked out. But it's fascinating to think about that. And yeah, what is it that's not getting exposed in the adult populations, or is it not part of the adult, clinical psychology world?
I don't think. Again, observing someone to that degree, or asking to observe someone to that degree, feels infantilizing. And as adults, obviously, we've become very good at developing our egos to a point where we struggle to tolerate that. Yeah. And we struggle to accept that we are not in control of our own destiny. And therefore, what I tell you, that the words that I say have to contain the facts and the truth. I think it was Mozart who said something like, it's not about the notes. The music is not about the notes. It's the space between the notes. And in a lot of ways, it's not about the words. It's the space between the words and how we got there, which really matters. And that's the bit that we do not explore at all. Yeah.
And it might not be that virtual reality or technology more broadly is the answer for being less filtered, let's say, or paying more attention to those silences between the notes. But at this point, we don't really have other tools, or we haven't really looked at or explored other tools that could allow us to do that. So if it can shed the light on those spaces, it might mean that we will go and use very different processes and different applications in the end. But I think it's very important for us to explore tech in its capacity to shed light on some of those dark corners that we don't understand. I mean, that's what happens with tech everywhere, right? We develop tech, and then in return, tech develops us, for better or worse. And so it's really up to us to decide which way we want to go with that. But I think there's definitely some ways where we should be curious enough and courageous enough to let it impact us back, and see where we go with that.
I love that. Yeah. When we were founding Psychedelics Today, we understood that perhaps psychedelics aren't going to be the be-all, end-all forever. Technology is going to come in and famous, I think, again, McKenna line, like drugs of the future will be computers and computers of the future will be drugs. And we're kind of seeing that. And not that Enosis is trying to do that, but it's, it's helping. And there's other, computer interesting electronic devices that can do some really interesting stuff. Have either of you tried the flashing lights that do some really interesting visuals? I don't really understand it, but it's fascinating. I've had a few big sessions. And that's just the start, right? Like you did in your process. What if you converged 5 technologies and got something more interesting even?
Yeah. And I really like what you said about, maybe psychedelics not being the answer, just like we are looking at VR as not potentially not being the answer, but they help us ask questions. And so again, one of the inspirations for us really was the fact that we absolutely want to work with psychedelic substances, and that's one of the arms of our business. But what we find more important than that is that psychedelics can inspire a very different way of thinking. So it's not necessarily about the change that can be brought on by the fact that we will be using those substances medically, but the change in how we understand consciousness, mental well-being, and mental health because of those substances and how they sort of shifted, how therapists should relate to the patient, how important just the presence is and guidance versus maybe having all the answers. So what our mission is to bring the psychedelic way of thinking into the mainstream mental health. And it doesn't mean that we have to bring the actual psychedelic substance in order to be able to bring that psychedelic way of thinking into that. So basically making sure that we can adapt that philosophy or that approach to mental well-being into the mainstream mental health that was inspired by psychedelic substances.
I like that. And this is a cool way of doing it. Like, we say it might not be the answer. Probably these things are going to be the answer for at least the next 30 years. Like, I don't see anything else on the horizon. So it could be a lot longer too.
The new SSRI coming out, that, I'm sure will be,
Where can I invest? Yeah. It's really interesting, right? Like it has to be frustrating as a psychiatrist too. Like how many amazing innovations have come out. Like there's not been too many really compelling psychiatric meds in the last couple decades, right? So
the last one was lithium.
There was somebody, we were chatting about some psychiatrist friends a couple days ago. One of their lines was the only drug I have that works is stimulants. Like everything else is a little bit of a roll of the dice, which is kind of like a raw thing to say, but it's also, I don't think it's entirely true, but I think there's some truth there to be mined. And
there's a lot of good symptom control with psychiatric drugs, and the biological model of psychiatry has been using symptom control as a masquerade for a treatment. But really, almost all of the drugs that we have in psychiatry they're training wheels on a bike, and that's all. You still got to learn to ride the bike, because if not, when you take the training wheels off, you're gonna fall. Or if the road gets too bumpy, you're gonna fall. Still got to learn to ride the bike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And are you seeing any movement in psychiatry generally? Sorry to go off the rails here with questions, but towards like a kind of I hate to use the C word, cure mindset as opposed to like a palliative mindset?
No. And I'll give you one really shocking example. 2 years ago, the College of Psychiatrists in Australia removed from its official they released their new treatment guidelines for depression, and they removed from that guideline as an evidence-based treatment, they removed psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy from that guideline. This is the basic premise of our entire profession. Right? This is what it's all based on. This is the genotype on which the phenotype of every other therapy, every other 3-letter acronym, DBT, MBT, ABT, CBT, that's what they're all based on. And to consider that should be, that gives us a very, that's a snapshot of where the profession seems to be sitting. And I would like to be able to say that to go through my entire private practice career without ever prescribing a psychotropic other than psychedelics. And if I can continue to manage to do that, then that will be that can be on my tombstone.
That's compelling. I love it. And it's I'm glad to hear that kind of attitude. And yeah, like obviously this is just one of many problems inside psychiatry, so you've got your hands full and your work ahead of you. But I'm glad people are from this scene kind of trying to, hey, let's keep improving. And it's not all tragedy, it's just a lot of tragedy.
To sort of bounce off Agnieszka's point about learning from psychedelics and bringing it into, that the greatest influence that the psychedelic movement can have isn't necessarily just psychedelic therapy, but bringing that way of thinking into psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy in general. So much of the focus in psychedelic therapy has been on the dosing session, whereas a lot of us would like to think that it really should be on the psychotherapy, and the psychedelic is purely that stimulus that ignites the insights, which you then take through psychotherapy. If that stimulus can be the stimulus which ignites a process of psychotherapy, and therefore the power of psychotherapy to produce change, and in that way bring psychotherapy further to the forefront of mental health treatment in a way it's completely disappeared and been replaced by biological methods, then I think we have won. Just by that, right? Yeah.
I love that.
But to do that, we need to remember that psychedelic psychotherapy is a procedure, and that involves all those other elements, and they have to be studied a little bit more rigorously. And also, like the very difficult thing in exploring VR as a psychotherapeutic tool was poring through all the papers on psychedelics that give account of all those different clinical trials, and the limited information that's actually provided on anything other than the dosing session. Yep. There is, what kind of psychotherapeutic framework was used, what kind of context was used, that all those procedural elements are almost just like a sideline mention, like an honorary mention in the paper that is about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but the psychotherapy component isn't really there. And that's a really difficult thing to explore as a researcher. There's a little bit of a trend in this changing, but still there isn't enough. But so there's that difficulty in understanding this as a researcher, but there's also the difficulty in really having faith in what's going to happen once we move away from clinical trials and go to the real world. Because, of course, everyone that is running a clinical trial is going to be very well trained. It's going to probably be the top of their game. Is going to work with patients who have met a list of that has gazillion items on it for the exclusion criteria. So only the most perfect of patients will be seen within most of the clinical trials, which has nothing to do with reality. So what's going to happen once those medicines actually are available for medical professionals to prescribe and to work with? We're going to see a slight, if not moderate, drop in the actual results that we see among patients. Mm-hmm. The patients who are going to, come to see therapists are going to be much, they're not going to be as well prepared. They're not going to meet all those exclusion criteria. They're not going to be your ideal patient, right? So how do we work with those patients, and how do we make sure that those amazing results that we see from clinical trials can actually be translated to the real world? And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, to have that bridge and to catch all those processes that are a little bit more difficult and that cannot be answered by either repeat dosing or by making the dose larger or more comfortable by just focusing on that dosing session, to make sure that once we actually move to the real world, we can see very similar results to the ones that we see from those advanced clinical trials.
I love that. Yeah. Comorbidities as well. Like, it's going to be a really complex situation. And I had actually been hopeful that we might get better results than the trials, but I think you're spot on about that. I think your logic is really tight. And yeah, as a result, like back to your solution, like medtech is important here, and client delivery of this to people is going to be outrageously expensive. So, how can we make the psychotherapy sessions better and more effective, right? And that's kind of the essence of it, right? Like additional tools to help make that part easier and better.
Two points on this. One, which goes back to the evolution of the company and where we came from and why we started thinking about this, was looking at the industry and where innovation in the industry was happening. And there have been actually billions that have gone into companies focused on drug development. And we understand why psychedelic drug development happens and is necessary, but it also seems almost hysterical that we have spent billions in developing the one thing that we already have, as opposed to every other element of that process, which is the human elements of the process, which really should be the low-hanging fruit, right? That's the us bits, not the bit that nature has evolved over millennia. This is the bits that we have developed over, at best, the last 70 years, right? That's it. The modern psychedelic revolution is at best 70 years young. Surely that's the bits that we should be looking at how we can improve, right? The second point was that those bits, the psychotherapy bits, are a black box, right? And that's regardless of psychedelic therapy. Psychotherapy is always a black box. No one really knows what happens in psychotherapy. No one has been able to quantify what happens in psychotherapy. It's a completely subjective, intangible little thing there. And one of the things that we've been trying to do and have been managed to do with building this out is a means of being able to actually objectively quantify to some degree the quality of the psychotherapy. And I'll give you an example. You take two patients after 6 weeks of therapy, and in one of the patients, the VR is able to spit out that they have basic data that they have had, let's say 20 different insights, 12 connections formed between insights, 8 different themes formed, maybe 4 symbolic functions and 1 drawing. And then you have another patient who in the same 6 weeks has developed 120 different insights, 48 themes, 20 connections between themes. Like immediately you get a snapshot of the quality of the therapy. You get a snapshot of where, in what direction the complexity and profundity of that therapy has gone. And you are able to pull out analytics on the quality of therapy that you had no idea of.
Whew. So actual metrics like that and mapping that to health outcomes would be really interesting. So I know you've put together some data. Can you tell me about what that project is like and what kind of data you came up with?
So we've done case studies with healthy volunteers in the Netherlands, and that was predominantly a safety and feasibility study. So we were looking at how people will respond to VR, how easily will they interact with this, and basically what is the level of feasibility of combining the anchoring VR scenario with psilocybin. So that was a psilocybin session at the retreat center. So that was in collaboration with Swinburne University in Australia and Psychedelic Society Belgium. And it was a very, very simple study. We used anchoring VR at the end of the psilocybin dosing session and then the next day during integration. And we've asked patients to just give us a broad account of how they felt about it, how they interacted with the model, and what do they feel about what it was useful for, or whether that was uncomfortable in any way. And the very dominant kind of thing that we hear from that was that patients were able to be reminded at the sort of psychological level of what their insights were, and they've already seemed to forget a lot about what they'd said, even though it was literally a day before. So we would hear that, oh, I said so much more than I actually thought I did. It was great to have those stars to be reminded of those insights. But more importantly, what we saw was that patients were reminded at an emotional level what that experience was like. We heard things like, I wasn't tripping anymore, but the scenario kept the marvel going. they felt that emotional load by hearing their own voice and hearing what they said, that connection to their psychedelic experience. So what we've learned from that is that we can induce a similar psycho-emotional state with the use of VR during the integration sessions to help patients remember at a psychological and at an emotional level what the experience has been like. And the impact of that is that one, potentially this could be treated as a little bit of an alternative to repeat dosing. That we can keep that state of afterglow going, which is one of the most potent states for the integration process, right? A lot of studies, especially earlier studies, would report that within the first 2 weeks after the psychedelic experience, that's the most potent time for integration, because patients are still in that emotional state that was evoked with psychedelics. So maintaining that for longer by repeat application of VR might give us more access to those emotions and might enable patients to process things a little bit more deeply. So these were the kind of results that we are seeing, and these were both with quantitative measures and qualitative measures. So we were very happy with that, and that kind of gave us an indication to keep going with the anchoring method, and then to explore the mind mapping further. And this is what we've been providing to the clinics that Prash spoke about earlier.
Love it. And do you have some upcoming research partners that you could talk about and what you're trying to do there?
Yeah, our main research partner at the moment is the Ovid clinics in Berlin. And they will be using they are using our VR in their ketamine program. So again, as Prash mentioned, they have their ketamine-assisted psychotherapy program, and they are now running VR-facilitated ketamine-assisted psychotherapy program as one of their arms. And we are just starting a study with them, which is an observational study that is run by Swinburne University, but is fully operated by the Ovid Clinic. So we will be collecting third-party data, which we have sort of no influence over, no access to until it's actually finished. And therefore, it's going to be a very reliable information for us in terms of how it works at the moment and what else can we do in order to improve it.
Just for context, Ovid Clinics is the clinics in Berlin run by the Mind Foundation, who run the Insight Conference, which will be in
end of August.
End of August this year. Yeah, great conference. Just as a sideline, I thought I should mention that. But,
you should all come. We're not getting paid for this yet.
Yeah. We're gonna try to make some sort of partnership with them as well. I'll be occupied in the desert, I think, right around then. So I'll make it in the future. But
yes, that.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. Like this whole field, like it's only one holiday we all kind of pseudo observe, and that's it. And it's like, how do we, Burning Man for those who aren't aware, but like, how do we, Europeans aren't coming to this, and Australians aren't coming to Burning Man as much as Americans are. So it is like maybe it's just a holiday from Americans for you all, which could be helpful sometimes. No, but I can't wait to get to Berlin, and I'm a big fan of Mind Foundation. We were going to have Sergio from the Mind Foundation present at our conference. It was going to be amazing. Didn't work out, but hopefully in the future we can do some more stuff with them. Love how active they are. It seems like they're doing a lot of the right stuff.
Yeah, they got a great ethos, very psychotherapy focused, very non-commercial, and that kind of thing is a breath of fresh air in the industry.
Yeah, I hope they can loosen up research funding in the EU or Germany specifically. That's been one of the biggest hurdles, I think, is how do we get science funding? I talk about this too much because I'm on the board of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and we're trying to get the U.S. federal government to open up psychedelic science research funding. And it's like, $20,000 donation to a lab produces that much result, but push it over to a lobby, unlock all that funding, then you're working with $20-30 million to fund your research, which is like, that's something we really got to consider.
Yeah,
absolutely. As a startup that has been completely self-funded to date, we understand the importance of funding.
Exactly. Same here. Are you able to talk about that at all, or are you kind of not able to talk about raising?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, what's the story? Where are you at right now?
Yeah. So as Agnieszka mentioned, we've been self-funded till now, and it's a nice position to be starting your first raise with already a product in market. Um, on the other hand, it's could be the worst possible time in recent financial history to be raising capital, but that's another story. But yeah, we are raising. This is our first raise, and we're raising to take what we have now and build an enormous amount of scalability into it, which will expand the scope of what we can offer far beyond psychedelics and towards general mental health care delivery. And we're looking for in some senses, we have the luxury of being able to try and find the right kind of partner. It does require some relative visionaries who can see the potential of something like this, which is very much a future technology. And yeah, finding that kind of right partner who can both, it's not just about the money, right? It's about bringing the right kind of networks and partnerships and ethos and ideology to us. And we're on the lookout. And if anyone is listening and thinks they fit that mold, we'd love to hear from them.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. I haven't had to venture into fundraising yet. It seems like quite the project. So I applaud you both for bringing your vision to reality this way. And yeah, and also for bringing it this far self-funded, which is a big deal. I know a lot of projects just don't get executed on because people aren't able to or willing to self-fund. So it's amazing. Did we miss anything else? I've got a few things sketched out, but I want to make sure you all feel like you got most of the good material out that you needed to.
Well, we could be talking for another hour.
Yeah,
just maybe go through your questions and I'll see if they hit on the things that I actually so wanted to mention.
All right. So say somebody's a clinician or is operating a larger clinic and would like to implement this. Is that possible?
Absolutely. Yeah. They are more than welcome to get in touch with us. There is either a contact form on the website or our email addresses are on the website as well. You can find us on LinkedIn too, and just get in touch and let us know what kind of operation you have, what kind of substances you work with, or whether you work with without substances. So if it's just psychotherapy that you want to make a little bit more experiential, a little bit more immersive, especially if you're thinking about potentially working with psychedelics in the future, it's a really good way to get there, to bridge that difference between the talk therapy and the more traditional approaches into those more experiential approaches and learning how to work with VR first. In fact, if you're based in Australia, we're offering our technology for free, given the recent TGA announcement that I'm sure Prash will have a lot to say about. It's one of the hot topics in Australia at the moment. But in order to kind of mitigate any potential problems, there might be a whole range of potential problems. So to mitigate a tiny bit of the potential problems, we are offering our technology to any therapists who have not trained in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because there's very, very few of them in Australia, but who wish to consider that in the future and who wish to develop more of those experiential skill set that's a little bit more unique. They can use VR to learn that and to set up a bit of that infrastructure that will make it easier to then bring the psychedelic substances into their practice.
Cool. And it's not just Oculus, right? You need the PC tied to it as well?
At this moment, yes. So this is what we're raising for, actually. So at the moment, it can be any headset and any gaming laptop that you require to use that. And what we're raising for is to move on to a completely online operation that requires only the headset, with the therapist being able to log in from anywhere in the world. And so that will mean that the scale will be much larger, and we'll be able to collect much more of the data that we're really hoping for.
Great. That's awesome. Yeah, I imagine as new gear comes out, that'll be even more scalable and a nicer, more immersive, helpful experience. What else? People are going to get upset that VR is going to be used in this process. Like, what do you like to say to help set the stage for for that kind of argument. Like it's kind of like traditionalists, like, oh, I think electric cars are too new, I'm going to wait another 30 years, or like, we're meant to walk, so I'm never going to go in a car. But like, how do you all approach this kind of conversation?
I can start with, yes, sure. The traditionalists will say that this is not how psychedelic therapy has always been done. Well, how has it always been done? Is there a how it has always been done? The answer is that there isn't. And certainly the way we do it now, in terms of translating it into mainstream, more medical models, is as far removed as from the way it's always been done as you can imagine. Sitting in a whitewashed room with one other person and talking to them in a very cognitive, analytical manner about the experience you just had is as far removed from the traditional way of doing it. And so it's just that we've been doing this for some time, and so it has buried itself within our subconscious as the modus operandi. And we would like to think that this helps to, if anything, move the dial closer back to a less linear, more variegated means of exploration, which is what more traditional healing methods always utilized. In some way, yeah, ironically, technology can help hark back to the true tenets of how traditionally it was almost done. But I think the core principle there is that there is no single way of how it's always been done. And so as humans evolve, and as we evolve, and as the industry evolves, we have to evolve with it. And technology in itself is amoral. There's no good technology or bad technology. It's how we use it. It's humans who decide which way it's going to be used. And that's the primary fallacy when amongst critics of technology.
And technology is everywhere. If you don't use your iPhone, and you don't have a advanced watch, and you don't drive a great car or drive at all, okay, good.
You can talk.
Great. You can, yeah. But you're still gonna have to take a flight to Peru, so not sure how you're gonna deal with that one. But essentially, technology is everywhere, and we can try to deny it and pretend that we don't want to have anything to do with that. But I think the most important question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is it that we want to achieve? Because we can achieve those things with or without technology, and I think the process is less important than the actual outcomes. If we're speaking about mental health and wanting to improve mental conditions, then these are the things that we should be focusing on. We should be looking at the outcomes. For some people, the outcomes might be achieved in one way, for others might be achieved in the other way. And there's definitely, what we've seen, there are some patients for whom those outcomes will be better achieved with the use of VR. And if you're, incredibly against any use of immersive tech or tech in general, just think about the potential advantages that can come from offloading a lot of the things that the therapist cannot do on their own during the therapy session onto that technology. So and that doesn't just apply to our VR technology, but just to give an example from how we work. If you consider the process that I described in terms of patients generating those audio records for themselves, and you know how the psychotherapy process looks like, you probably immediately thought that these are the patient notes, because they are. And at the moment, the patient's notes are created by the therapist. They're usually written down during the therapeutic engagement. And automatically what happens is that because there is that need for the therapist to be taking those notes, their presence drops a little bit, right? Like, you can't be taking notes and pay full attention to your patient. And that's all you want as a patient, right? You want that full presence of your therapist. Another thing that happens is that you almost never see those notes, because the notes stay with the therapist. Who goes through those notes? Even if you had access to them, would you actually read through them? I know there's a percentage of people who go through their own journals, but how many of us take notes without actually going back through those journals? Some therapists give you homework to work through things at home, but how many of us actually do that? So if we can have a process of offloading the therapist's need for taking notes, and instead turning that into the process that the patient is responsible for and that belongs to the patient. We can then empower patients to actually generate those notes for themselves, to have access to them permanently at any moment that they need them, and in a way that is much more digestible than something that is written down, because you can actually just go back into your model and you can listen to individual notes that have that emotional load and are audio notes, which already makes it much easier. But you can, even without doing that, by just the virtue of going into that environment that is already built up and has all those nodes and connections and plants and stars and everything else that you've generated, there's this immediate reminder of what your therapy session was like. And that immediate reminder is both for you as a patient and for the therapist. So they have a much clearer understanding of your processes. They remember those processes on every session. And so you can really pick up from where you left off, which really isn't that often the case. Like, we can't expect therapists to remember hundreds of patients' stories in detail. That's just not realistic. And so, but we can expect technology to do so. And I think that's the best use of technology, right? Where it can take care of the things that we don't necessarily have to. So we can do what we do best, which is that therapeutic engagement and that therapeutic alliance and the connection, right? Because that's the one thing that we want to maximize in therapy.
Yeah, I love it. And you're right, we could go on for a long time here. So I guess let's wrap and hope we get to do it again. I would love to stay in touch with you all and see how this is developing. So what's the website for your project?
enosistherapeutics.com.
Great. And anything else you want to shout out? People you want to mention, anything like that?
Oh, we've got so many people that have been so incredibly helpful and supportive. So I feel like if we start naming them, we're going to forget a few, and it's going to feel terrible if we do. But yeah, I do want to have a shout out to the people that did the panel with us at South by South. Skip Rizzo, Walter Greenleaf, and Murat Yücel, who have been very supportive and very helpful. Anyone who's on our advisory board and is working with us, there's been a lot of support that we've been receiving with them. And as you mentioned, Sergio as well, who's an incredible human being, and we love working with Ovid clinics. That's a very important collaboration for us. And there's probably 100 other people that we could be mentioning, but I'll stop there.
I know how it goes. Yeah. Cool. And yeah, just the final comment, not the way it has always been done. Like, that's and that's the way a lot of people think, but that's such an outrageous way of thinking. We have to conform to history. It's like, that's kind of part of the problem. We've been a little bit too conforming to history. So I would encourage folks to, take this to heart, experiment with new tech, see if this works for you, see if other solutions work better for you, whatever. And, hopefully you all have a massive success and have not only a great clinical impact, but expose more data. Like, I'm really excited about the data end of this. And yeah, my first impression of the product was really impressed. I was very impressed. And it took me a moment, and then I was like, oh, I see what's happening here. Everything's been kind of pseudo physicalized, and like the symbolic importance of that, I think, is just can't be overstated. So, anyway, thank you both for all your work. And, if there's anything else we can do in the future to help spread the word, please do let us know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.